The weight of judgment. Dr. Richard Collins strode through the hospital corridors with an air of authority, his white coat pristine and his expression unwavering. Every step he took echoed off the polished floors, a reminder of his status as one of the most accomplished surgeons in the country. His reputation preceded him. Patients traveled from all over seeking his expertise. Nurses and junior doctors admired his precision in the operating room, his ability to make life-or-death decisions with a calmness that others envied. But beneath the accolades, beneath the clinical excellence, was a side of Richard few dared to speak about openly, a prejudice that tainted his interactions, an arrogance that blinded him to the humanity in front of him. This was evident as he reviewed the chart of his next patient while making his way toward the examination room. Gloria Johnson. Richard's lips curled slightly in disdain. He could already picture the patient before stepping inside. Another low-priority case. Another waste of time. With a deep sigh, he pushed the door open, his expression carefully neutral but cold. Gloria sat on the examination table, her dark brown eyes filled with worry and hope, hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. She was a woman in her early 40s, with deep smile lines that suggested a life of both laughter and struggle. She was well-dressed, her modest navy blouse neatly tucked into a long skirt, but Richard's eyes skimmed past all of that, already convinced he knew everything about her. "Mrs. Johnson," he greeted, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "What seems to be a problem today?" Gloria offered a small, nervous smile. "Doctor, I've been having sharp pains in my abdomen for a few weeks now. It's getting worse. And today, I noticed some swelling. I've never felt anything like this before. She hesitated. "I'm really scared." Richard barely glanced at her as he flipped through her chart, his mind already dismissing the severity of her condition. "I see no prior history of serious medical issues," he noted aloud. "Could be indigestion, menstrual cramps. Have you taken anything over the counter?" Gloria shook her head, her fingers tightening in her lap. "No, Dr. Collins. This isn't normal for me. The pain, it's not something I can just ignore." Richard sighed heavily, irritation creeping into his tone. "Mrs. Johnson, pain can be subjective. Some people are more sensitive than others." Gloria's brows furrowed. Richard cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "If it were anything serious, you'd know." He snapped the chart closed. "Take some ibuprofen. Drink more water. And if the pain persists, follow up with your primary care physician." For a moment, silence filled the room. Gloria sat motionless, her lips parted slightly as if struggling to find the right words. Then, quietly, she said, "But, doctor." Richard's patience was razor-thin. "Mrs. Johnson, I have other patients waiting. If I believe your condition warranted further concern, I would order additional tests. But from everything I see here, you're overreacting." Gloria flinched at the coldness of his tone. Richard barely noticed. His mind was already moving on to the next patient. As he turned toward the door, he tossed one last remark over his shoulder. "Next time, try not to be so dramatic. It's unbecoming." The door clicked shut behind him. That evening, Richard returned home to his quiet, upscale neighborhood. The scent of roasted chicken wafted through the air as he stepped inside his modern, meticulously arranged house. He tossed his briefcase onto the entryway table and loosened his tie. "Dad, you're home." His 11-year-old daughter, Emily, came bounding down the staircase, her golden curls bouncing with every step. Her face was lit with excitement, her school uniform slightly rumpled from the long day. Richard's face softened as he caught her mid-jump, pulling her into a hug. "There's my little scientist. How was school today?" Emily beamed. "It was amazing. Lily and I got paired up for our science project. We're going to build a whole solar system." Richard smiled. "Lily, your best friend, right?" Emily rolled her eyes. "Dad, I've told you about her like 1,000,000 times." Richard chuckled, leading her into the kitchen, where his wife, Sarah, was setting the table. "That's right. I remember now. Lily's mom is so cool, Emily continued, grabbing a plate. She works so hard and still helps Lily with everything. She even offered to help us paint our planets this weekend. Richard raised an eyebrow as he poured himself a glass of water. That's kind of her. Emily nodded enthusiastically. She's amazing, Dad. She's always so kind and patient. Even when she looks tired, she still finds time for everyone. Richard listened absent-mindedly, not fully processing his daughter's words. Lily said her mom hasn't been feeling well lately, Emily added, her tone shifting slightly. She's been really tired and having a lot of stomach pain. Richard frowned slightly. A small thread of curiosity tugged at the back of his mind. Did she go to the doctor? Emily nodded. Yeah, she went today, but the doctor said it was nothing serious. Richard took a sip of water, not giving it much thought. Well, unsure if it was anything important, the doctor would have caught it. Emily didn't seem convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she continued setting the table. Sarah glanced at her husband, sensing his exhaustion. Long day? She asked. Richard exhaled, rolling his shoulders. You have no idea. He didn't mention Gloria. Didn't mention how he dismissed her concerns, how he had barely listened. And in that moment, he had no idea that his actions, his blind arrogance, would soon come back to haunt him in ways he never expected. The next morning, Gloria woke up with a jolt of pain that stole her breath away. She doubled over in her small kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as sweat beaded along her forehead. The swelling in her abdomen had worsened overnight, and an unbearable nausea rolled through her. She barely managed to get Lily off to school, pasting on a smile as she assured her daughter everything was fine. But the moment Lily was out the door, Gloria collapsed onto the couch, pressing a trembling hand to her stomach. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And the doctor who should have seen it, who should have helped her, had turned her away. She needed help, but going back to Dr. Collins, the thought made her stomach twist with both fear and humiliation. She had no choice. Swallowing her pride, Gloria reached for her phone and dialed the clinic. At the hospital, Richard sat in his office, flipping through patient files, unaware that his past decisions were about to come crashing back into his life. And this time, there would be no turning away. This time, the consequences would be undeniable. This time, he would be forced to face the weight of his own judgment. The consequence of dismissal. Gloria Johnson sat hunched over at the small dining table in her modest apartment, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The pain had become unbearable, a searing agony radiating through her abdomen with every breath. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She had endured discomfort before. She had pushed through sleepless nights, worked double shifts to keep food on the table, and smiled through exhaustion. But this was different. This was something she couldn't fight off with sheer determination. A part of her wanted to believe Dr. Collins, that maybe she was just overreacting, that maybe it really was just indigestion, but deep down, she knew better. This wasn't normal. Something was terribly wrong. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, feeling the distinct swell beneath her fingertips. It hadn't been this bad yesterday, had it? Her phone lay a few inches away, the screen still illuminated from the last call she had made, her clinic. The receptionist had politely informed her that Dr. Collins wasn't available today, and that if her symptoms had worsened, she should seek emergency care. Emergency care. The words echoed in her mind, sending a cold shiver down her spine. She couldn't afford an ER visit. The medical bills from Lily's last school physical had already strained her budget, and a trip to the emergency room could mean missing rent. What choice did she have? A sharp, stabbing pain ripped through her, and she gasped, her body folding over itself. Mom. Gloria's head shot up, her heart pounding. Lily stood in the doorway, her backpack slipping from her small shoulders, her brown eyes wide with fear. You're home early. Gloria forced a weak smile, straightening up despite the pain. Lily, sweetheart, You don't need to worry about me. A wince cut her words short. Lily rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her mother. You're not okay, Mom. You need a doctor. Gloria swallowed the lump in her throat. But we can't afford. I don't care about that. Lily's voice wavered, her hands gripping her mother's. You're always taking care of everyone else. Please let someone take care of you. A lump formed in Gloria's throat. She saw the desperation in her daughter's eyes, and in that moment, she realized she couldn't afford to ignore this any longer. With a shaky breath, she nodded. Okay, baby, she whispered. I'll go. The cold reception. The waiting room of St. Mary's Clinic was as crowded as ever. A mix of patients shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, some scrolling through their phones, others murmuring anxiously to one another. Gloria sat hunched in one of the plastic chairs, her arms wrapped protectively around her abdomen, trying to keep her breathing steady. The receptionist had checked her in, but her name had yet to be called. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Lily sat beside her, gripping her mother's hand tightly, her small fingers pressing into Gloria's palm. Every so often, she would glance toward the front desk, as if willing them to call her mother's name. Gloria felt exhaustion pull at her. Her body felt heavier than ever, her head clouded with pain. Finally, the door swung open. Mrs. Johnson. Relief flooded Gloria's body as she forced herself upright, pulling Lily with her. A nurse led them into a small examination room, instructing her to change into a gown. A few minutes later, the door creaked open again. Dr. Richard Collins stepped inside. Gloria's breath caught in her throat. The same dismissive eyes, the same indifferent posture. For a split second, she saw the ghost of her past humiliation standing before her. Dr. Collins barely looked at her before flipping through the chart, his lips pursing. Back again, Mrs. Johnson? He asked, his voice clipped. Gloria swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. Doctor, the pain has gotten worse. My stomach is swollen. And I. Richard sighed loudly, rubbing his temple. Mrs. Johnson, we went over this already. It's likely just gas retention or mild gastrointestinal discomfort. If you'd simply follow my advice and... Doctor, please, Gloria interrupted, her voice desperate. This is different. It's like nothing I've ever felt before. I can't sleep. I can barely eat. The pain is unbearable. Richard finally glanced up at her, irritation flashing in his gaze. Pain is subjective, Mrs. Johnson. Lily stiffened beside her mother. Doctor, please, she spoke up, her voice shaking. Please help my mom. Richard's eyes flickered toward the little girl. A sigh. A shake of his head. Mrs. Johnson, I can't justify ordering unnecessary tests for something that will likely resolve itself in a few days. My job is to prioritize urgent cases, not to entertain every minor ailment. Gloria's heart sank. That was it, then. He had already made up his mind before even walking into the room. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Dr. Collins scribbled something onto a piece of paper, handing it over. Here's a prescription for a mild pain reliever. If your symptoms persist, then... Lily stood up abruptly. No. The outburst startled both Gloria and Richard. Lily's small frame trembled, her fists clenched. You're not listening. My mom is sick. Why won't you listen? Richard blinked, momentarily stunned. Gloria reached for her daughter, pulling her close. Lily, sweetheart, it's okay. No, it's not okay. Lily's voice cracked. Doctors are supposed to help people. You're supposed to help my mom. The words struck something deep inside Richard, something he wasn't ready to confront. For a moment, a flicker of discomfort crossed his face, but just as quickly, it vanished. Without another word, Richard turned and left the room. The door closed with a soft, final click. Gloria closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. Lily clutched her mother's arm, her breathing uneven. Mom, she whispered. "What are we going to do?" Gloria forced a weak smile, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. "We'll figure it out, baby," she murmured. "We always do." The collapse. Hours later, as Gloria made her way home, her body finally gave out. She had just stepped through the front door when a sudden wave of dizziness struck her. The world tilted. The pain flared, sharp and unbearable. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Then, darkness. The last thing she heard before the world disappeared was Lily's terrified scream. In a hospital across town, Dr. Richard Collins sat at his desk, oblivious to the consequences of his actions, oblivious to the fact that the woman he had dismissed, the woman whose symptoms he had ignored, was now fighting for her life. And soon, he would come face to face with a truth that would shake him to his core, a truth that he could no longer deny. The breaking point. A blaring siren cut through the night, its wail piercing the otherwise quiet neighborhood, as paramedics rushed through the front door of Gloria Johnson's apartment. The small living room, dimly lit by an old lamp, was filled with a frantic energy. Lily knelt beside her mother, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Gloria's limp hand. "Mom, Mom, wake up," Lily sobbed, shaking her gently. "Please, don't leave me." Gloria's skin was clammy, her face unnaturally pale, her breathing shallow. The paramedics moved swiftly, checking her vitals. One of them, a young woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, quickly assessed the situation. "BP's dropping fast. She's barely responsive. We need to move now." A male paramedic turned to Lily, his voice softer. "Sweetheart, we're going to take your mom to the hospital, okay? You can come with us." Lily wiped her eyes and nodded frantically, refusing to let go of her mother's hand. As they wheeled Gloria out on the stretcher, neighbors peered out from their doors, murmuring in concern. Some recognized her, Gloria, the hard-working single mother who always had a kind smile. But none of them knew just how close she was to losing her life. And neither did the man who had dismissed her pain. The shock that shook him. Dr. Richard Collins was in the middle of reviewing post-op reports in his office when his assistant, Maria, poked her head in. "Dr. Collins." He didn't glance up. "What is it?" "We have a critical case coming into the ER. Female, mid-40s, severe abdominal distress. The paramedics suspect possible internal bleeding. They need a lead surgeon on standby." Richard sighed. "Dr. Chen is on call tonight. Why isn't she handling it?" Maria hesitated. "Dr. Chen just stepped into surgery. You're the next available senior physician." Richard ran a hand down his face, exhaustion gnawing at him. Another routine case, another problem that someone else had let escalate too far. He grabbed his coat and made his way to the ER. As he walked in, the paramedics were already briefing the nurses. Patient collapsed at home, non-responsive for at least a minute before regaining partial consciousness. Rapid swelling in the lower abdomen, likely due to a ruptured mass. Richard grabbed the patient chart from the intake nurse. His eyes skimmed the name at the top. Gloria Johnson. His heart stilled. His grip on the clipboard tightened. No, it couldn't be. His eyes snapped toward the gurney, where Gloria lay unconscious, her breathing labored. The room around him blurred as realization crashed into him like a tidal wave. The woman he had dismissed. The woman whose pain he had ignored. The woman whose concerns he had brushed aside with cold indifference. Now she was fighting for her life. And it was his fault. A race against time. Richard sprang into action, snapping orders. "Get her into emergency surgery now. Prep for an exploratory laparotomy. If she's hemorrhaging internally, we need to stop it immediately." Nurses rushed to follow his command. Richard could feel their glances, surprised, uncertain. They had never seen him this frantic before. As they wheeled Gloria toward the operating room, a small figure burst through the double doors. "Mom." Lily. Her tiny body shook as she tried to push past the nurses, her face streaked with tears. Richard froze. Lily's gaze locked onto him, And for the first time, he saw something different in her eyes. Not just fear, not just sadness, but something deeper. A plea, a demand, a silent, desperate question. Are you going to save her, or are you going to fail her again? Richard turned away before the weight of that question crushed him. We're doing everything we can, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Then he disappeared into the OR. Redemption on the table. The surgical suite was filled with a controlled chaos. Machines beeped urgently. Sterile metal instruments gleamed under the bright overhead lights, and a team of skilled professionals stood ready. Richard scrubbed in, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had done thousands of surgeries. But this one was different. He had let his bias and arrogance almost cost this woman her life. Now he had one chance to make things right. Scalpel, he ordered. A nurse placed it into his hand. Richard took a deep breath. Then he made the first incision. For the next 4 hours, he worked with relentless focus, removing the mass that had been causing Gloria's agony. He repaired the damage, controlled the bleeding, and ensured that every last trace of the infection was cleared. His hands, steady as always, now carried a new sense of purpose. By the time he placed the final suture, the weight on his chest hadn't lifted. He had saved her. But had he truly made things right? Awakening. The following morning, Richard sat beside Gloria's hospital bed. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady now, her breathing strong and even. She was stable. He had done his job. But now came the hardest part. Gloria stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her gaze was unfocused at first, but when she saw him, recognition dawned. Dr. Collins, the doctor who had ignored her, the doctor who had dismissed her suffering. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Richard quickly poured a glass of water and handed it to her. She took a slow sip, then set it down, her eyes never leaving his. A heavy silence stretched between them. Finally, Richard spoke. Gloria, He hesitated, words failing him for the first time in his life. I was wrong. Gloria didn't say anything, but her expression told him to continue. I should have listened to you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have taken you seriously. And because I didn't, you nearly lost your life. Gloria swallowed, her fingers tracing the IV line in her arm. My daughter, she murmured, her voice hoarse. She's fine, Richard reassured quickly. She's waiting outside. She hasn't left your side. A hint of relief crossed Gloria's face. Richard clenched his hands together. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said honestly, but I need you to know that I regret what I did. Gloria studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since meeting him, Richard felt truly exposed. Finally, she sighed. You made a mistake, she said, her voice quiet but firm. And you nearly cost me my life. That's not something I can just forget. Richard nodded. But she continued, surprising him. You saved me when it mattered most. A lump formed in Richard's throat. Gloria exhaled, sinking back into her pillow. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, she admitted. But I see that you're trying. Richard felt a rush of something unfamiliar. Hope. I'll keep trying, he promised. A small, tired smile ghosted over Gloria's lips. Outside the room, Lily and Emily sat together, their hands intertwined, waiting for the moment they could finally see Gloria awake. And for the first time in his life, Dr. Richard Collins understood something he had ignored for far too long. Medicine wasn't just about science. It was about humanity, and he had almost forgotten what that meant. The weight of redemption. The hospital hallways were quiet, save for the occasional beeping of monitors and the muffled conversations of nurses making their rounds. In room 214, Gloria Johnson lay resting, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Her face, once twisted with pain, was peaceful now, yet the weight of what she had endured still lingered in the air. Outside the room, A small figure sat curled up in a chair, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Lily hadn't left her mother's side since she had arrived at the hospital. She had refused to go home, to sleep in her own bed, to do anything except sit there, waiting for the moment Gloria would wake up. Richard Collins stood several feet away, watching the little girl from a distance. He had seen many family members camp out in hospital corridors before, waiting on loved ones in critical condition, but something about this scene gnawed at him. Maybe it was the way Lily clutched the frayed ends of her sweater sleeves. Maybe it was the dark circles beneath her young eyes, the exhaustion clinging to her frame. Or maybe it was the fact that he was the reason she had nearly lost her mother. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Doctor." He turned at the soft voice and found his daughter, Emily, standing there. Emily, his bright, curious, intelligent girl. The one who had never known him to be anything other than a brilliant, respected surgeon. But what would she think if she knew the truth? "Dad." Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. "Can I go see her now?" Richard nodded. Emily hesitated. "Lily's been waiting all night. I don't think she's slept at all." Richard glanced at the small girl again, his throat tightening. "I'll take care of it," he murmured, facing the child's judgment. Richard approached slowly, kneeling beside Lily's chair. The girl's eyes flickered up at him, and for a moment, he saw it, the distrust, the uncertainty. She recognized him, not just as the doctor who had saved her mother, but as the doctor who had refused to help her in the first place. He cleared his throat. "Lily?" The girl stared at him warily, but didn't speak. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your mom is stable now," he said. "She's doing well. The surgery was successful." Lily swallowed, but she still didn't say anything. Richard shifted uncomfortably. He had expected relief. A thank you, maybe. Instead, he got silence. And then a whisper. "You didn't listen to her." The words cut sharper than a scalpel. Richard blinked. "Lily, You didn't listen," she said again, stronger this time. Her small hands balled into fists in her lap. "She told you something was wrong, and you didn't care." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He had faced criticism before, angry family members, lawsuits, even media scrutiny. But this was different. This wasn't about his career or his reputation. This was a child staring at him, telling him the truth. No embellishments, no dramatic accusations, just raw, honest disappointment. And it was unbearable. "I was wrong," Richard admitted, his voice quiet. "I didn't take her seriously, and that almost cost her her life." Lily stared at him. Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "I can't change what I did, Lily. But I promise you, I won't ever make that mistake again." For a long moment, Lily didn't move. Then, slowly, she looked away. And Richard knew that while he had saved Gloria's life, he had lost something else. The trust of an 11-year-old girl. And maybe, just maybe, that was worse. The conversation that changed everything. Later that evening, Richard sat in his office, staring blankly at the wall. For the first time in years, he felt lost. He had built his entire career on being the best, the most efficient, the most skilled. And yet, he had failed in the most fundamental way. A knock at the door startled him. He turned to see his wife, Sarah, standing in the doorway. "I ran into Emily on my way in," she said, stepping inside. "She told me what happened." Richard exhaled heavily. "I suppose you're here to tell me what an awful person I am." Sarah gave him a small, knowing smile. "No, I think you already know that." Richard huffed a laugh, shaking his head. "I thought I was doing everything right," he admitted. "I thought that being a great doctor meant being the most logical, the most precise. But now," he rubbed a hand down his face, "now I don't even know what kind of doctor I am." Sarah crossed the room, perching on the edge of his desk. "You're learning," she said gently. "That's what matters." Richard scoffed. Tell that to Lily." Sarah's expression softened. "It's going to take time, Richard, but you've already taken the hardest step." Richard frowned. "And what's that?" "Admitting you were wrong." The words settled over him like a weight. He had spent so much of his career avoiding those words, believing that mistakes were unacceptable, that emotions had no place in medicine. But now he saw the truth. Mistakes weren't the enemy. Refusing to learn from them was. An unexpected request. 2 days later, Gloria was well enough to sit up and hold a conversation. When Richard entered her hospital room, she looked at him differently. Not with resentment, not with gratitude, but with something in between. Something that said, "I see you now. I know who you really are." Richard took a breath. "How are you feeling?" Gloria tilted her head slightly. "Better, thanks to you." He nodded, unsure of what to say. Then, to his surprise, she spoke again. "I want to ask you for something, Dr. Collins." Richard stiffened. "Of course." Gloria studied him. "I want you to promise me that you won't let this happen to anyone else." Richard's stomach dropped. "Gloria, I don't need another apology," she interrupted. "I just need you to do better." Richard's throat tightened. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, just a quiet expectation, an opportunity, a choice. Richard nodded, his voice firm. "I promise." Gloria gave him a slow, measured look. Then she offered a small, tired smile. And for the first time, Richard felt lighter. A new path forward. 1 week later, Richard stood in front of his medical team. "I've made mistakes," he admitted openly, his voice steady. "And I can't take them back. But what I can do is change how we treat our patients moving forward." Murmurs spread through the room. Richard took a deep breath. "No more assumptions," he continued. "No more dismissing concerns. Every patient deserves to be heard. And it starts with us." A silence stretched across the team. Then, one by one, they nodded. And just like that, Richard Collins, the doctor who had once prided himself on being untouchable, took the first step toward something greater. Toward humility. Toward compassion. Toward redemption, the reckoning, and the road ahead. The tension in the hospital conference room was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Dr. Richard Collins, a man once known for his unwavering confidence, some would call it arrogance, stood at the head of the room, facing a group of doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators. It wasn't often that a senior physician voluntarily admitted to his mistakes, but here he was, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights, the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. "I need to address what happened with Gloria Johnson," he said, his voice steady, but the undercurrent of regret unmistakable. The room fell silent. Many of his colleagues had heard whispers of the case, how the great Dr. Collins had dismissed a patient who later nearly died because of his negligence. Some of them had been there in the ER when Gloria was rushed in, her life hanging in the balance. "Before she was admitted, Mrs. Johnson came to me with complaints of severe pain," Richard continued, his hands clenched at his sides. "I dismissed her symptoms as minor discomfort. I didn't listen. I made assumptions based on bias, not science, and because of that, I nearly cost her her life." The silence stretched, the weight of his words settling over the room like a thick fog. He let the confession sink in before continuing. "I am standing here today because I refuse to let this happen again. Not to her, not to anyone." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others exchanged uncertain glances, as if struggling to reconcile the man in front of them with the one they had known for years. Dr. Maria Fields, a respected internist, crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. "This is surprising, Dr. Collins. You've never exactly been known for self-reflection." A few chuckles spread through the room, but Richard didn't flinch. He deserved that. "I know," he admitted. "And I know that this isn't something I can fix overnight. But I need to start somewhere." Dr. James Miller, A younger physician who had always admired Richard's skill but had been wary of his bedside manner, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" Richard took a breath. Here it was, the moment of truth. "I want mandatory empathy training for every doctor in this hospital," he said. "A program focused on listening to patients, recognizing bias, and understanding the full picture before making a diagnosis." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. "Bias training," someone murmured. "That's not exactly something you've supported before," Dr. Fields pointed out. Richard met her gaze without hesitation. "Because I didn't think I needed it. But I do. We all do." A few heads nodded. "I also want a new policy in place," Richard continued. "If a patient insists that something feels wrong, we take them seriously, no matter what." More murmurs. This was a different Richard Collins than the one they had known. But was it enough? A visit from Lily. After the meeting, Richard sat in his office, staring at his desk. The weight of everything, the confessions, the changes he wanted to make, felt heavier than he had expected. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in." The door creaked open, and to his surprise, it wasn't another doctor or administrator. It was Lily. Richard's breath hitched. The last time they had spoken, she had barely looked at him. Now she stood in the doorway, small and uncertain, clutching the sleeve of her sweater. Richard slowly stood. "Lily, I wanted to talk to you," she said quietly. He nodded, gesturing for her to sit, but she didn't move. Instead, she took a deep breath and asked the question that had likely been sitting on her heart since the night her mother collapsed. "Why didn't you help her?" The words hit him like a hammer. Richard swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Because I was wrong," he said honestly. "Because I thought I knew everything. And because I didn't listen when I should have." Lily stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. She had seen adults lie before. She had seen doctors rush patients out the door, too busy to really care. But she didn't see that now. She saw something else. A man who had made a mistake. A big one. A man who wasn't asking for forgiveness but was trying to earn it. Lily shifted on her feet. "Mom says you saved her." Richard nodded. "I did. But I should have done it sooner." Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then finally, she said, "She's awake now. She's feeling better." Relief washed over Richard. "That's good." Lily bit her lip. She said you apologized." "I did." Another pause. Then Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Richard furrowed his brow as she placed it on his desk. "What's this?" Lily hesitated. "It's a list." Richard picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was written in the uneven scrawl of a child. Messy, but thoughtful. Things doctors should always do. Listen to patients. Don't assume they're fine just because they don't look sick. Be kind. Don't make people feel small. Help. Richard's throat tightened. He looked up at the little girl in front of him, the weight of her trust, what little of it remained, hanging in the air between them. "I'll remember this," he said softly. Lily nodded once, then turned toward the door. But before she left, she hesitated. Then, without a word, she reached out and squeezed his hand. It was small, quick, but it was enough. And then she was gone. Richard stared at the list, feeling something shift inside him. A promise. A reminder. A second chance. The cost of change. The halls of St. Mary's Hospital bustled with their usual rhythm. Nurses hurried between patient rooms, doctors consulted charts, and the steady beeping of monitors filled the air. But in the heart of it all, something was different. Dr. Richard Collins wasn't the same man he had been a few weeks ago. The realization of his own failure had been like a blade, cutting through the arrogance he had once worn like armor. He had stood at the top of his profession for years, respected by peers, and feared by those beneath him. But now, as he walked through the corridors, he felt the eyes of the staff lingering on him, not with admiration, but with curiosity. Richard had always believed that change was something he forced upon others. Now, for the first time, he found himself on the other side of it. He had promised Gloria he would do better. He had promised Lily he would listen. But keeping those promises would be harder than he had ever imagined. A doctor's reputation. Did you hear? The hushed voices of nurses followed Richard wherever he went. Dr. Collins is implementing mandatory empathy training. Yeah, right, like he actually cares about that. I don't buy it. He's just trying to cover himself after what happened with that patient. Richard kept his expression neutral as he turned a corner, but inside, the words stung. It wasn't as if he didn't expect it. His reputation had been built on efficiency, not compassion. He had prided himself on his ability to cut through emotions and get to the facts. No wasted time, no unnecessary kindness. That kind of reputation didn't disappear overnight. As he reached his office, he found Dr. James Miller leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. The younger doctor had always looked up to him, but now his face was unreadable. "James," Richard greeted. James didn't move. "So, is this some kind of PR stunt?" Richard exhaled, unlocking his door and stepping inside. "Come in." James hesitated before following. Richard sat at his desk, tapping his fingers against the wooden surface. "You think I'm doing this for show?" James shrugged. "You tell me." The Dr. Collins I knew wouldn't have spent 5 minutes thinking about a patient after they left his office. Richard clenched his jaw. "I was wrong." James raised an eyebrow. "You're admitting that?" "Yes," Richard said, voice firm. "And I'm not just admitting it. I'm changing because of it." James studied him for a long moment before sighing and sinking into a chair. "Look," James said, rubbing his temples. "I'm not saying people can't change. But this is a big shift, Richard. People aren't going to believe it right away." "I know," Richard admitted, "and I don't expect them to." James leaned forward. "Then why do it? Why put yourself through all this when you could just let it blow over?" Richard hesitated, his fingers stilling. "Because of Gloria, because of Lily, because of every patient he had dismissed over the years, thinking he knew everything when, in reality, he knew nothing about their pain. Because I don't want to be that kind of doctor anymore," he said finally. James studied him before nodding slowly. "Well," James said, standing up, "I hope you mean it." Richard watched as the younger doctor left, and for the first time in a long time, he wondered if earning back respect would be harder than earning it in the first place. Gloria's recovery. A few days later, Richard knocked softly on the door of room 214. Gloria was sitting upright now, her complexion healthier, her strength slowly returning. The sight of her awake, alert, and breathing without struggle made something settle in his chest. Relief, maybe even redemption. "You're looking better," Richard said as he stepped inside. Gloria chuckled softly. "And you're still showing up. I have to admit, I didn't expect that." Richard pulled up a chair. "Neither did I." Gloria studied him for a moment. "So, what happens now?" Richard exhaled. "Now you continue recovering. And I." He hesitated. "I do my best to make sure no one else goes through what you did." Gloria nodded slowly. "That's a good start." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Gloria tilted her head. "Do you know why I didn't just let this go?" Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" Gloria folded her hands in her lap. "I could have sued. Could have gone to the press. And trust me, I thought about it." Richard swallowed. He wouldn't have blamed her if she had. "But I realized something," Gloria continued. "If I had done that, you probably would have defended yourself, dug in your heels. You would have convinced yourself that you didn't do anything wrong." Richard looked away. "You're probably right. So instead, I decided to do something harder." He met her gaze again. "I decided to give you a chance to change." The words hit him harder than any lawsuit ever could have. Gloria smiled, a small, tired smile. And I think you're starting to. Richard let out a slow breath. I hope so. Redemption is a process. Weeks passed. Richard's changes to hospital policy weren't met with immediate acceptance. Some of the senior doctors pushed back, resistant to the idea that empathy training belonged in medicine. Others simply didn't believe he had really changed. But he kept going. He sat in on patient consultations, making sure every case was thoroughly examined. He advocated for patients who had been overlooked. And most importantly, he listened. One evening, as he finished a long shift, he found Lily and Emily waiting outside his office. Lily hesitated, then held something out. It was the crumpled list she had given him before, only now it had an extra note at the bottom. 6. Keep your promises. Richard looked up at her, a lump forming in his throat. Lily met his gaze, her small voice steady. You're doing better, she said, but you still have work to do. Richard nodded. I know. Emily grinned. Come on, Lily. Mom says we have to be home before dinner. Lily gave Richard one last look, then turned to follow Emily down the hall. Richard unfolded the list again, running his fingers over the words. A reminder, a challenge, a promise. He wasn't the same doctor he had been, and he never would be again. A different man, a different doctor. Dr. Richard Collins sat in his office, staring at the medical files spread across his desk. The weight of his past mistakes still lingered, but for the first time in his career, he wasn't running from them. A month had passed since Gloria Johnson's emergency surgery. In that time, he had fought to prove, to himself, to his colleagues, to Lily, that he was a different man. That he was no longer the doctor who dismissed concerns, who let prejudice blind him to the truth. That he was trying. But the road to redemption was longer and harder than he had anticipated. Even after weeks of change, skepticism still shadowed him. Some nurses no longer walked on eggshells around him, but they still exchanged wary glances when he took extra time with patients. Some doctors respected his efforts, but they still whispered in break rooms, wondering when the old Dr. Collins would resurface. And Lily. She no longer looked at him with anger, but trust. That was something he hadn't earned back yet. Richard ran a hand through his hair. Change wasn't instant, and he still had work to do. A promise fulfilled. Gloria Johnson sat in a wheelchair, her discharge paperwork resting on her lap. She had beaten the odds. The woman who had once collapsed on her living room floor, moments from death, was now leaving the hospital under her own strength. And standing beside her, pushing the wheelchair, was the man who had nearly cost her that chance. Are you sure you don't want a nurse to take you down? Richard asked, his voice carefully even. Gloria smirked. Are you trying to get out of your last promise to me, Dr. Collins? Richard exhaled through his nose. It had been a quiet agreement between them. When the day came that Gloria was strong enough to leave, he would be the one to wheel her out. A symbolic act. A silent understanding that his role in her story was not just as the man who failed her, but the man who chose to be better. As they moved through the hallway, nurses and doctors turned to watch. Some whispered, some simply stared, but Richard didn't care. Not anymore. When they reached the hospital doors, Lily was already waiting. The moment Gloria saw her daughter, her entire face lit up. Mom. Lily ran forward, throwing her arms around her mother. Richard stepped back, giving them space, watching as Gloria wrapped her arms tightly around her child. For all the pain, for all the fear, this moment made it worth it. And then Lily turned. For the first time since the night in the hospital, she met Richard's eyes, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with something softer, something that, maybe one day, could grow into forgiveness. Thank you, she said. Richard's chest tightened. You're welcome. Lily hesitated, then reached into her pocket, pulling out the crumpled list she had once given him. Only now, another addition had been scrawled at the bottom. 7. Never stop learning. She handed it to him without a word. And Richard took it, Grateful, humbled, changed. The legacy of change. Months passed. The skepticism surrounding Richard's transformation never fully disappeared, but something else began to take its place. Respect. His empathy training program was no longer an afterthought. It became mandatory for all staff. Doctors began taking longer with their patients, asking more questions, listening instead of assuming. Richard started working with medical schools, teaching young doctors the lesson he had learned the hard way, that a physician's duty was not just to cure, but to care. And slowly, bit by bit, trust was rebuilt. One day, as he finished his rounds, he received an unexpected visitor. Gloria. She stood in the doorway of his office, healthier than ever, holding a coffee cup in one hand. "I thought you might need a break," she said, handing it to him. Richard accepted it, raising an eyebrow. "This isn't poisoned, is it?" Gloria laughed, a real full laugh. "Not today." Richard smiled, leaning back in his chair. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, taking the seat. "Back to work, back to life." "I'm glad to hear that." Gloria tilted her head. "And you? How's the great transformation going?" Richard exhaled. "Harder than I expected." Gloria chuckled. "Change always is." A pause. Then softly she added, "But you're doing it." Richard glanced at her. "Do you believe that?" Gloria met his gaze. For the first time, there was no hesitation in her answer. "Yes." Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe he couldn't erase the past. Maybe he couldn't undo what he had done. But he could build something new. And in the end, maybe that was enough.